That's one of the things that chapter 3 shows us kind of behind the scenes. The other thing that it shows you is that everybody had to take a risk and make a sacrifice, but also there was a place for every person. What you have in Nehemiah chapter 3 isn't what you have in the typical church setting or the soccer games. How many people are on a soccer team? How many people are on the field? Anyone know? No, we're Americans. We don't watch soccer. No, we do now, evidently, but you got like 20 people on the field in desperate need of rest, and you have 20,000 people in the stands in desperate need of exercise. You ever heard of that slogan? It's 20% of the people doing 80% of the work. That's kind of what you have in most churches. That's not what you had in Nehemiah chapter 3. What you had in Nehemiah chapter 3 was every single person in and around Jerusalem committed to the task. Total involvement, comprehensive involvement. You know why? Because they truly believed that God was in this thing. And if they didn't become a part of what God was going to do, then they were going to miss out on something. Total involvement. I went through and kind of listed them out. So instead of reading all of chapter 3, let me just give you a highlight of who was involved. You had the high priest and all of the priests who were involved. Elisha, you saw him in the first verse of chapter 3. He was kind of the top dog religious establishment person. And then he had all of his fellow priests behind him. And so that's pretty significant because he puts it first. Basically, what that's telling you is that God's man was supported, or God's work and God's man Nehemiah was being supported by the religious establishment, not just of Jerusalem, but all around the city. All of Israel was saying, this is God's work. The divine approval had been placed on it. And so here you have preachers who weren't just preaching on Sunday morning. They weren't just doing their temple duties. They weren't just staying in the four walls. They were outside, they were involved, they were getting their hands dirty. They weren't just working one day a week, okay, like some preachers do. Not saying I'm that preacher, but I'm saying some preachers work one day a week. Not these preachers. They were committed. You had the priests. You also had people who were out-of-towners. It talks about the men of Jericho in chapter 3. And that's really not significant to us because we're geographically removed, but if you were in that day, that would basically be equivalent to people not just driving in from Tuscola, but relocating from Fort Worth to Abilene, because you couldn't just drive back and forth. You had to move. And so they left their families, they left their farms, they left everything for the sake of the vision. There was a place for every person, even out-of-towners, even people who would say, you know what, I don't really benefit from this vision. There's not really at stake here. If this doesn't get done, I don't stand to lose much, but because I believe God's in it, I'm going to commit to it, even the out-of-towners. It wasn't just the men of Jericho. It was the men of Tekoa, Gibeon, Mitzpah, Zanoah, Beth Hakerem, Beth Zur, and Kaliah. All of those villages surrounding Jerusalem, they all came in. They all had a place because there was a place for every person. You had white-collar people serving in the vision. And I call them white-collar people because I don't know really what else to call them. They were the perfumers. They were the craftsmen. They were the people who they had jobs in which they couldn't get their hands, too dirty. And you know what they could have said? They could have told Nehemiah, I just can't hurt my hands. My hands are so precious. My hands is needed for making my perfume. They could have probably wouldn't have said it like that. They were Hebrews. They would have, my hands, coughing and stuff. But they didn't say that. They didn't say, Nehemiah, I went to school so that I wouldn't have to do this kind of work. They didn't say something like that. They were Hebrew, not British, but they didn't do that. They could have said any of those things. They could have said, you know what, I'm a craftsman. I'm beyond this. My skill set is not doing what you're asking me to do. But even the white-collar people committed to the vision because there was a place for every person. Not just the white-collar people. You had bachelors. You might make this an equivalent to a young person, a youth. And, instead of sitting inside in their room playing Nintendo all day, they said, I'm going to commit to what God's doing in Jerusalem with the temple. Did they have families to protect? No. Did they benefit if the wall was up or down? Didn't make them a hill of beans. no difference in their world, but because God was in it, they committed to the vision. You had city officials, city guards. You might equate those to police officers and mayors. When you read in chapter 3, ruler over the district of this and ruler over the district of that, that's basically saying they were political people. So imagine the mayor of Abilene getting involved in the dirty work of construction. They weren't above it. It wasn't below them. They weren't saying, hey, I've got to protect the city. I can't work on the wall. Every single person stopped what they were doing for 52 days because there was a place for every person. Because a job this big, a God-sized vision, requires that every single person is mobilized for service. That's what you see in the text. And if you want to relate that to our church, God has given us a vision. And the vision that God has given us, just take the 2015 vision of seeing 500 people come to faith in Christ. Just take that alone. That is such a monumental and huge task that it would take every single person in this church to be mobilized for ministry. That there would be a person in every place and a place for every single person. Everybody worked in Nehemiah's day. Everybody except the turkeys from Tekoa. I don't call them turkeys because they wouldn't work. They call the nobles of Tekoa. You saw them there in verse 5. They would not stoop to serve their Lord. Okay, they didn't serve, but every single other person served. So the question we ask ourselves this morning, as it relates to my involvement at Broadview Baptist Church, am I a turkey from Tekoa, or am I committed to being a person in the place that God has for me?